This week, I'm talking to Patrick Worms. I first met Patrick at the Institute of Chartered Foresters dinner. He was a guest speaker and he was absolutely brilliant, so I couldn't wait to speak to him again. Welcome to this week's episode of Tree Lady Talks. He's a senior science policy advisor for the Nairobi-based World Agroforestry Centre. He is also the president of the European Agroforestry Federation, treasurer of the International Union of Agroforestry, and senior fellow of the Global Evergreening Alliance. Patrick, I'm so excited to see you again because we met at an after-dinner presentation for the Institute of Chartered Foresters, and you just blew my mind and you made us all feel full of hope. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Sharon.
So tell us about young Patrick. How did you start off being interested in the natural world?
Oh, well, I became interested at Cambridge, where I did my undergraduate degree, because back then we already started talking about climate change. I know it wasn't in the media, but it certainly was a topic of conversation in the JCR. And so following that, I joined the European Commission and got involved in environmental remediation projects, first in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and then in the countries of the former Soviet Union. And you may recall those days, our job was to bring love, peace, and happiness, otherwise known as market democracy and capitalism, to these countries who were just escaping the clutches of communism. And it was absolutely fascinating. And that got me interested in what today we call nature-based solutions, because it was so obvious that so many things were going wrong or had been done wrongly simply because of not so much a misunderstanding of what the consequences could be, but a misapprehension or a miscosting of the costs of these consequences and the benefits that you would get out of them. And one thing leading to another, I finally ended up with the World Agroforestry Centre, today known as C4ICRAF, the Centre for International Forestry Research, and the International Centre for Research in Agroforestry, which is a research organization that, as the name suggests, studies the role of trees in human-dominated landscapes, either forestry or agroforestry, and has two headquarters, one in Indonesia for the forestry side, and one in Kenya for the agroforestry side.
What does the World Agroforestry Centre do?
Well, it's been around since 1978, and what it does is it studies the role of trees in agricultural landscapes, and it does so from every perspective imaginable. So at the geeky extreme, we've got data specialists and geneticists who are trying to engineer trees to make them more productive. An example might be you have a very promising tree that has not yet been domesticated. So you figure out how to domesticate it, how to reduce its time from seedling to fruiting from 15 or 20 years to 5 years, etc. And at the other extreme, we've got gender specialists and economic specialists and social specialists who are trying to understand how we can help farmers make money from these systems. In the middle, we've got a lot of people interested in the agroecology of trees, how trees bring greater resilience to farming systems, how they help you cope with droughts, with floods, with pests, how they help even out your income streams, how they can help you cope with nutrition. If you're a poor African farmer, the likelihood that your kids receive all the nutrition they need is pretty low. If you've got the right suite of fruit trees growing around your house, that likelihood rises substantially. So all of these things have been done or are being studied. So we published 10,000 pieces of scientific research over the 70-odd years since we've been active. We write policy briefs. We're involved in the great regional debates like the Great Green Wall, the global debates like the COPs on biodiversity, on climate, or on desertification. And we do all that by doing science in action. And what that means is we sit down with the farmers under the village tree and we help them work out what their best strategies are to achieve what they need, which is peace of mind. That's my job. My job is to help farmers receive peace of mind, to reduce their anxiety levels, to make them better able to withstand life's challenges. And you are in the UK, you understand that farming is not easy, but in the UK and in Europe, we are surrounded by a comfortable blanket of protection. We've got great infrastructure, we've got great security, we've got social support if we need it, we receive help from the government if something really bad happens, we've got insurance mechanisms, etc., etc. If you are in a village in rural Niger or Mali, and that's it. You don't grow food, you starve, your kids starve.
Wow.
So helping them build up that resilience, helping them find new ways of extracting more security from the land that they call their own is the essence of what we do. And it turns out that by adding trees to those systems, by adding different kinds of trees to these systems, by helping them to manage these trees for different purposes, you can actually achieve a lot and help them move substantially in that direction.
So much to unpick from that. First of all, the 10,000 studies. Now, tell us where in the world that you operate in terms of being on the ground. There is a map on the website, but tell the listeners the sort of area that you work in.
So mostly in the global tropics and subtropics, and almost everywhere. So if you start in the West, we are active in Peru and in Central America and in Brazil, across most of Africa under the Sahara, in South Asia, in East Asia, in Southeast Asia. We've even done work in North Korea and in Central Asia and in Russia. But mostly it's the tropics and the subtropics that we work in. The way that it's financed is mostly through donor funding. So the development aid from Great Britain or from the US or from Sweden or from Norway or from Belgium or from the EU. And sometimes from private foundations. And as I'm sure you understand, funding that kind of research in poor countries is always a bit of a challenge. So if anybody out there is listening to this and suddenly has a few £1,000,000 to spare, you know who to call.
The 10,000 papers must cover a multitude. I mean, you spoke earlier about the physical science. So the soil sciences are so very different in those regions. The climates are very different. The cultures are very different. The economics and the political systems are all very different. It's a huge, complex jigsaw. And I'm heartened to think of where we've got areas of soil degradation, where the Great Green Wall is going, that what we're doing here is actually to improve the soil in those regions, to also make it more sustainable. Perhaps you could talk through the science of how planting trees and sustainable agroforestry really helps restore some of these degraded soils.
I'd be happy to. The most basic things will be familiar to most of your listeners, I'm sure. Trees have deep roots. That means they pull up nutrients from parts of the soil which crops cannot reach. That gets turned into twigs and into leaves, which then fall onto the soil surface where they eventually rot, making their nutrients available to the crops. They reduce wind speeds. That means they reduce evapotranspiration. They provide shade, which means that in hot climates, imagine the Sahel, for example, that band of hot terrain just south of the Sahara, they help crops to continue growing during the hot middle of the day, when without that shade, the stomatas would just close and the crops would conserve their water resources and wait for cooler climes. They provide habitat, and that habitat is helpful for pest antagonists. They provide products which can even out the income that you get from crops. A crop is typically something that you harvest once a year, and then you keep some in reserve to feed yourself and you sell some on the market. But with a tree, you can harvest firewood all year round, for example. You can harvest leaves, which are a form of vegetables for certain species all year round. You have fruiting times that can vary. If you plant the right trees, you can have trees that fruit most of the year, which means you have the high nutrition that comes from fruit for most of the year, and you also have additional products that you can bring to market. So for all of these reasons, having trees helps the farming system. But perhaps the biggest impact is the impact it has on the soil, because it evens out the extremes of heat and cold and of wetness and drought. And because the roots generate sugars, which are then used by microorganisms in the soil to go about their lives and to provide micronutrients back to the tree, you have much better soil biology and you have much more soil carbon. And that in turn is useful to the farmer, but it's also a public good. We like soils to have more carbon because that's carbon that used to be in the atmosphere and is now in the soils. Now, I don't want to overplay this. You know, the Sahel is dry. You don't have that much agricultural productivity. So in dry lands, you obviously get less of this impact than you get in more humid areas, but it's nevertheless there. But the most important reason why you would do it is because of that sense of resilience. Mm-hmm. And that resilience extends all the way through. Suppose you have, in many cultures, funerals are very, very, very expensive affairs. When you have a respected elder who dies, you're going to have to feed 200, 300, 400 people. Even if you're a poor farmer, and you're going to have to feed them with meat, which is hugely expensive. There is no such thing as death insurance in those countries, but you can cut a few trees and sell the timber, and that allows you to cover these kinds of costs. So for all of these reasons, having trees in landscapes is hugely helpful.
And I'm guessing also we're using less water in terms of the agriculture because of the shade, and also shading livestock. So presumably they're healthier.
Absolutely. The livestock is happier, and there's some studies, although not all studies, showing that this generates more milk in dairy operations. You need a lot less water for irrigation, and it even has a positive effect on aquifers and groundwater recharge. Work we did a few years ago proved, and done in the Sahel as it happens, proved that when you have the distributed tree cover that they're typical of a park or the savanna, that's when you maximize groundwater recharge, because you've got relatively little runoff. You have a lot of runoff when it's dry, bare ground. And you have relatively little evapotranspiration. You have a lot of evapotranspiration when you have a full canopy forest. So it's these intermediate tree covers. They not only are they ideal for agriculture and livestock rearing, but they're also great for restoring water function in water depleted landscapes.
And I guess also they give people hope. And if people are eating more nutritious food, obviously, and have that, I love the phrase you use, peace of mind. Because when we have peace of mind and we're not literally fighting for survival, that's when personal and intellectual growth can be realised, because you're literally not just scrambling for something to eat and actually benefiting wider society as well as the family itself. It all sounds wonderful.
Absolutely. It even there's tantalizing signs that it has a direct positive impact on security or insecurity. Because if the farm works, young men have hope.
Yes.
If the farm doesn't work, young men have no hope. And then it's very difficult for them to resist the blandishment of a recruiter for a criminal gang or a jihadist outfit or what have you, who is offering $100 and a Kalashnikov.
So people have more agency over their lives. This all sounds 100% positive. But why hasn't it been happening historically? Why have we got to this place where we need to educate and research and take these measures, where it seemed to me that it's a very obvious and self-sustaining system?
Well, you're right. It is an obvious and self-sustaining system, and it is the agricultural system that most of the planet used for millennia and millennia and millennia. We just stopped that at the beginning of the 20th century. And if you're the kind that likes to go to flea markets, just look at the old postcards of the landscapes. You see lines of trees and hedges everywhere. But from the 1930s onwards, we got new toys. And my God, these were powerful.
Yeah.
Diesel, mechanization, irrigation, fertilizer and pesticides. My God, these toys, they're great. Suddenly, your farming productivity exploded. You have a problem with pests? In the olden days, you had a problem. In the new days, you spray some, the problem just disappears. Your plants are looking a bit sickly, they need more nutrients. Just buy a bag of the right fertilizer, put it on, and boom, the plant is growing. There's a reason why maize plants in England are deep green and 9 feet tall, whereas maize plants in Malawi are kind of a sickly yellowish green and only 4 feet tall, right? It's fertilizer. These tools are fantastic, but we behaved with these tools in the same way that a child behaves at Christmas. The new present, that's the only toy I'm interested in. All the old toys are gathering dust in a corner. And that's exactly what happened to us. The old toys, agroforestry, hedges, windbreaks, crop rotations, introducing legumes, including manure from the animals, all of that was kind of forgotten. And that was encouraged by governments, especially after the Second World War in the West, where we had near famine conditions across most of Europe and famine conditions in places like Holland. So, of course, policymakers go, productivity, we need to produce more food, and we're going to do whatever we can to do it. And that influenced the way that agriculture was taught in universities. It influenced the way that agricultural advisory services were working. It influenced even the financing of banks, because banks had incentives to help farmers grow their farms by buying land, but no incentives to help farmers plant trees. There were explicit programs to remove hedges in places like France or Belgium because they were seen as being counterproductive. All these small little pieces of land, that's no good. We need great big fat fields, right? So the whole machinery was directed towards producing more and more staple crops. And it worked. We are producing a surplus of staple crops. We have so many staple crops that basically most of the maize we grow in the world today is not to feed people, it's to feed animals and cars. It's biofuels and animal feed. So but the downsides of these new tools started becoming apparent to the cognoscenti from the 1960s onwards, and became apparent to the wider public and policymakers. My best guess is from around the 2000s onwards. We began to talk more and more about land degradation, about eutrophication, about pollution, about the link between pesticides and certain human diseases, etc. So we are now understanding that we need the old toys that were gathering dust in the corner. We're trying to refurbish them, but we've forgotten them. It's been 3-4 generations now. There's very, very few farmers left in the rich world who remember what a mixed farming system looks like. So yes, you have a lot of kids who are trying to do it, coming out of the cities and doing horticulture in agroforestry system. And that's great, they're experimenting, but it's not this, it's great to know that your lettuce comes from an agroforestry system, but ideally you'd like your wheat and your maize and your soybeans to come from an agroforestry system too. And there it's slower. And you find that around the world, actually, when farmers farm in an environment in which some trees are left for whatever reason, they will switch over to agroforestry far more quickly than if they farm in an environment where the trees were completely taken out 40 or 50 years ago.
So much to unpick there as well. I mean, I did my degree in the mid-80s, and it was a general geography and landscape degree. And I was very radical about conservation. Well, I still am. And we were talking about some of the issues that you discussed, but it was against the norm. You know, I mean, it was seen as being a bit weirdo, green person at the time in the mid-80s. But we do have a greater awareness, and I think that many of us can see the link between healthy soil, healthy food with better nutritional value, healthy body and healthy mind. So that is now beginning to happen in the UK and in the, as you call it, the rich world. But going back to the areas where you work, what are the barriers for farmers who say don't have any trees at the moment? They don't have anybody in living memory who used to farm in a traditional way, which worked for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. What are the economic and cultural and social barriers towards getting some trees and sticking them in the ground and waiting?
Well, the simplest is that managing a tree is different from managing an annual crop. And farmers are not trained in how to manage trees. When do you prune it? What should you aim for? Should you aim for a big canopy or a small canopy? Do you prune it every 2 years or over 5 years? And that has a significant financial impact because of the labor costs of doing these jobs. Farmers don't know. And farm advisors don't know either because they're trained in growing annual crops. They're not trained in integrating trees. So advice is missing. And if no neighbor is doing it, you don't have these informal networks of advice that farmers rely on to try new things, right? The second thing is the whole system is geared to the massive production of simple crops. If you are, I'm going to stick to the UK example and then move to Africa, but if you're in the UK, in Cambridgeshire, for example, and you have 300 hectares, 600 acres, and you're growing wheat, the whole system is designed for that. You have trucks and storehouses and buyers that are geared on wheat. If you suddenly start growing, I don't know, a rotation of half a dozen different crop plants, and you're adding animals, and you have a few tree species that produce fruits and nuts, you're not going to have any buyers because there is no network, there is no history of that multi-cropping system in that landscape. So even if you want to move in that direction, and you have people like Stephen Briggs in Cambridgeshire who have moved in that direction, and he's added apple trees to his wheat system.
Yes, I've met him. It's amazing.
It's fantastic, right? But even he, with all his amazingness, is limited to a very simple system: wheat, apples. Because it's hardly possible to do something more complicated and make money from it in that environment. In Africa, it's a bit different. Most of Africa still has some agroforestry left. But there, the problem is different. People associate agroforestry with the way that my grandparents did farming, and that wasn't productive. I want to be productive. So they dream of a tractor, they dream of a treasure harvester, and they dream of having enough money to have 1,000 hectares and cover it with land and cover it with fertilizer. And that's not helped by the fact that the commercial farms that do exist in Africa operate exactly like the farms in the US or Europe operate. They're very large, they're highly capital intensive, etc. With one difference, the soils in Africa are much poorer. So these farms that operate at that commercial level are desertifying their lands much more quickly. To caricature, our lands in Europe have been labored for hundreds of thousands of years by big ice sheets. That means they're very deep and very rich, and we can do whatever the hell we like to these soils, they'll still be productive. Africa has some of the world's oldest soils, and these soils have been leached of nutrients by millions of years of rain. They're fragile. You plow them up once, and that's it. They're gone. Not all of them, obviously. There's large variety. So there, the difficulty is that people can see that the rich world became rich in part because it used fertilizers and pesticides and all the rest, and they want to become rich too. And who can blame them, right? So you need to. So the lesson is not an either or. The message is not an either or. Plant trees and avoid pesticides. The message is make sure your tool bag is full of the right tools, and the right tools do include trees.
And what about pressure to fell trees for firewood and deforestation?
That's where agroforestry really comes into its own, especially in conservative cultures in West Africa, because it's the job of women to find girls and women to bring firewood back home for the cooking. And if you have to walk 2 or 3 hours into the bush, then the risk of being attacked, of sexual attacks, is extremely high. Integrating trees around the farmstead, hedges, windbreaks, that sort of thing, and then learning how to prune them for a regular supply of firewood just removes that risk entirely. And so in some communities or in some families, that's like a clinch argument. The men go, oh yeah, I'm going to plant lots of trees.
Interesting and rather, well, very sad that should be the reason.
It's one of the reasons. When you talk to people under the village tree, there's many conversations, many aspects. And what you're doing is you're helping them work through themselves what they really need. And in this particular case, for example, people are going to need fast-growing trees that prune easily. In other cases, where the risk balance is different or the perception of risk is different, people will want fodder trees for their animals, for example, or fruit trees for their kids, or timber trees because there's a ready market for high-quality timber. I mean, people take decisions on what to grow for the same reasons that farmers anywhere else in the world take decisions on what to grow. What's going to bring me money? What's going to reduce my risk?
Yes. And how has this helped the role of women and children in some of the societies that you work in?
Well, beyond the obvious help of having firewood close to the home is the fact that in many cultures, tree products are women's work and women's income. So the classical one that almost every one of your listeners will have in their bathroom is products made with shea butter. And I'm currently eating a piece of chocolate, and chocolate also contains shea butter because it's cheaper than cocoa butter, so manufacturers use it. And the shea tree grows in the sub-Sahel region, so in a band in West Africa, starting in Senegal and moving all the way to Sudan. And almost everywhere, it is women's work to harvest the shea nuts and to process the shea nuts to make the shea butter. And it's used for many purposes. It's used for on your skin. That's why we know it as a cosmetic. It's also used as a cooking fat. It's a cooking oil. And so rejuvenating the shea parklands is a great way of helping women and girls. Another thing that's important is women are responsible for the nutrition of their children. And in poor environments, people's diet is mostly vegetarian, and it consists of a staple grain, whatever you grow, maize or millet or sorghum or what have you. And if you only eat that, your nutrition is going to be too limited. So an easy thing you can do is to plant a suite of anywhere between 5 and 7 different tree species, carefully selected for that particular soil and that particular climate and that particular farming system, which will do two things. It'll give you nutrition through the fruits or the leaves throughout the year, and it will give you calories during the hunger period. The hunger period is a time when your reserves from last year are running low and you're not yet harvested the new crop. And a typical hunger period tree is one that your listeners will know very well. It's the avocado. It's a fruit that is very rich in calories, very rich in fats, so it's great nutrition. And in many environments, it matures at just the right season.
So tell us about the knowledge for Greater Green Wall Action.
Right, so that is, the Great Green Wall is an effort that was launched by the African Union about 20 years ago to stop the desert. At the beginning, it was a dream by the then Senegalese president, Abdoulaye Wade. And what Wade pictured was something quite simple, a 15-kilometer wide band of trees marching south of the Sahara, all the way from Senegal in the west to Djibouti in the east. And to give you a reader some idea, that distance is greater than the distance between London and New York. I mean, it's big.
Wow.
Right? And fairly rapidly realized that that was a silly idea. But at the beginning, you actually had very silly things going on, like bulldozers clearing the natural vegetation and planting fast-growing seedlings, which all died. But now it's become much more sophisticated than that. The Great Green Wall, now the vision is of a mosaic of land users, integrating trees and crops and livestock, adapted to the local soils and the local conditions, focusing on land restoration, land regeneration, combating land degradation, dealing with water issues. And that means that there is a need for people to share experience and share knowledge. And very often that doesn't happen well in the region, not because farmers are stupid and not even because they lack mobile phones, but for even simpler reasons. A Wolof speaker in Kaffrine, Senegal is not going to be able to communicate with a Hausa speaker in Zinder, Niger. So you have some very simple things that need to happen for that to happen. On top of that, there is scientific knowledge on how to increase your return on investment. Planting trees, it's all the fashion now is for planting trees. You have billion tree campaigns and trillion tree campaigns and all that. And when badly interpreted, like it has been in some countries where you have a massive effort and the government goes out with a president and we're going to plant 1 billion trees in a day or whatever it is, that doesn't work. 97 to 99% of your seedlings just die because planting a tree is like having a baby, right? I mean, when you plant it, that's not when the job stops. That's when the job really gets going. You have to raise that tree in the same way that you have to raise children. So you need that experience out in the landscape, and there's all sorts of tricks that you can use. I mean, if somebody in Chad has developed a new way of growing fodder in extremely arid environments for their animals, that's going to be of great interest to pastoral communities across the whole of the Sahel. So you need to get that out there. You also need better ways of monitoring what's going on, because donors who are paying for much of this want to know that their money is going somewhere. And there, paradoxically, the fact that Africa is poor has some advantages. For example, at C4EURAF, we have something called the LDSF, the Land Degradation Surveillance Framework. And what that is, it's a combination of remote sensing and ground truthing that allows you to get pretty accurate data on a pixel by pixel level for over 30 different variables connected to soil. pH, rooting depth, carbon, proportion of annual grasses, perennial grasses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we can only do that in Africa and to a lesser extent in parts of Latin America and Asia. We can't do it in Europe. And the reason is simple. In Europe, we're rich, which means that every farmer pays for their own soil tests. And those soil tests are not shared in a common repository, which means that there's no good ground truthing for the imagery that you get from satellites. In Africa, farmers are poor. So we've been collecting soil samples for the last 25 years or so. Basically, we do it every project we can. We shoehorn soil sample collection in there. And we've kept these soil samples. We have hundreds of thousands of soil samples in our vault in Nairobi. And when technology improves, these soil samples get analyzed again and again. So, today the state of the art is spectroscopic analysis. You don't need to do the chemical analysis anymore that you did 20 years ago. It gives you better, more accurate data. That means we can rerun these soil samples. And for certain environments, in the so-called sentinel landscapes, we have time series. We started, the oldest soil sample is 30 years old, and then we have one that's 25 years old, one that's 17 years old, one that's 9 years old, and one that we collected yesterday. And that allows you to train machine learning algorithms so they get better and better at interpreting satellite imagery. And that's why we're able to provide soil trend maps that are of much higher quality there than we can anywhere else on the planet. And that's helpful for governments, for example. So you work, notably those governments who are trying to do the Great Green Wall, because there it's not just anecdotes, it's data. And the governments can see what works and what doesn't.
Fascinating. But what about anecdotes? Is there any particular family or farm that springs to mind that you can really have seen a positive change?
Lots. I'll take I talked a lot about the Sahel. Let me talk about Southern Africa. There is this place called Mpansha, which is near Rufunza in eastern Zambia. And it's an environment in which you have mixed farming systems in that people grow maize and they have 1 or 2 cows. And it's a very low trust environment. People don't trust each other, which means that every family that has their 1 or 2 cows is sending a kid out to watch over that 1 or 2 cows. And that kid then is not in school, and it's also the kid's not going very far from the village. So all the kids with all of their cows stay close to the village where they completely degrade the soil and it becomes dusty desert. The cows are happily giving their diseases to one another. So you need to spray them or dunk them or shoot or give them drugs all the time. And of course, the productivity is very, very, very low. So you get non-educated children, great poverty, land degradation, and sick livestock. Great. How do you solve that? You solve that by doing something called holistic grazing management. And at its simplest, holistic grazing management is put lots of cows together and make sure they eat the grass on a piece of land for no more than 6 to 12 hours, maybe a day or 2, depending on the season. And then you move them on and you leave that piece of land to rest for a whole year until you come back and you do it again. What advantage does that bring? Well, the cows are not just eating the same grass again and again and again, and thereby killing all the palatable grasses while manuring all of the toxic and thorny stuff that they don't touch. Instead, they're eating what they like, trampling the thorny stuff that they don't like into the ground, so it becomes a mulch, manuring all of that, and moving on. And the grass has time to grow back and be healthy again. The advantage from a health perspective is the same. The ticks, the disease-carrying ticks, the vectors fall off the cow into the land and then wait for the next cow to pass by. But when the next cow is only coming by a year from now, that tick's going to starve. So you have no more disease in those environments. And the labor force required is much, much lower. In the example of what's happening in Pansha, you have 3 herders for 450 cows. So as opposed to 450 cows, there would have been 200 kids or something like that before. So who are suddenly in school. Then you have, then people they can see the advantage. The forest is reviving. There's more mushrooms. There's more fruit. There's more flowers. The milch cows are placed at night. It's the Southern African term is kraaled. They're kraaled at night on the fields of maize that people have and manure that. And there's a strict rotation about who gets the benefit of the cows when, right? Because everybody wants it on their field immediately, of course. So you have a huge benefit in terms of productivity and in terms of ecosystem restoration. And when I was last there a couple of years ago, the head herder was telling me that his biggest problem now was that he had seen kudu again, he had seen zebra again, so animals were coming back into that valley, which was completely degraded before, and he now had to scratch his head and worry about how to protect his livestock from the lions when the lions would come back, because the lions would, of course, follow these wildlife into the area. Finally, from the perspective of the kids, they suddenly go to school and they get better nutrition. Now, why does this not happen at scale? It's because people don't trust each other. It took, the guy who organized it told me it took 4 or 5 years for people to learn to trust each other enough to get started, because there's nothing easier than hiring a herder and the herder comes back 2 days later and says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, somebody stole your cow." That happens all the time. So that's why people have low trust. So trust is crucial. The second example comes from the Ruwenzori Mountains, which is in western Uganda. And that was years ago. And I was invited there by a cement company that wanted to increase the amount of biomass the farmers would produce in order to fire its cement kiln. And one of the key crops there is coffee. And the biomass is the husks from the coffee. So the company had gone out there a few years before I turned up and had hired an agronomist and brought better coffee varieties, better banana varieties, better cassava varieties, and put them in the landscape and told the farmers how, the agronomist told the farmers how to handle them. But when I turned up 3 years later to have a look, the coffee bushes, they were not very high. The cherries on them, there were a few cherries, but they were sickly. They clearly didn't have enough nutrients. The cassava wasn't doing great either. The bananas were doing okay. And the people were still poor. And next to that failing land, there was this place which was filled with trees. And I asked, oh, is that the cemetery? Because in Africa, very often the cemetery is the last place where the trees will be left standing, because you don't touch the trees. You have no idea what the ancestors might do to you if you did, right? So no, that's not, it's a farm. Ooh. I went to have a look, and there were coffee bushes in there. Were they planted at the same time? Yes, they were 9 feet high. They were overloaded. You had different tree species. I didn't count them, but there must have been 12 to 15 different tree species growing in that land. The soil was deep, black, rich compared to the soil in the rest of the village, which had that lateritic reddish tint that you so often find in those environments. You had little channels with little wooden sluice gates, so water could go somewhere. That was coming from a pond in which carp were swimming. So it was water that contained fertilizer that was going in the right direction. And a woman came to meet me, and she was, unlike the other farmers, she was dressed in new clothes. And unlike the other farmers who were reed thin, she was fat, which is a sign of wealth in those environments. And I said, wow, this is fantastic. What happened here? And she wouldn't answer for a few minutes. She was just looking at her feet. At first, I thought it was shyness. She was ashamed. She was ashamed. She was ashamed because she had ignored the advice of the agronomist that came 3 years previously together with the new genetics, and had continued farming the way that her grandmother had taught her. And the only thing that I could do to demonstrate that this was a good farming was to fall to my knees and kiss her feet, and they, the best farmer in Western Uganda. But then when we asked around why people didn't imitate that, because obviously she was doing much, much better, is a phenomenon that we find in all farming systems. Everywhere you find great farmers and the neighbors don't imitate, that's because people focus on what's different between the successful farmer and themselves rather than what's similar. In this particular case, why was she successful when you asked the neighbors? Well, she was a sorceress, so of course she'd be successful. Or she had the help of a Muzungu, a white man, and it turned out that 8 years previously or something, some hippie kid who was into permaculture traveled through the area and stayed on a farm for a few days. Those kinds of excuses. And that's why people say, of course I can't do it. I'm not a sorcerer and I don't have a Muzungu friend, so I cannot farm properly. And so that's where the sociology of farming becomes so important, right? In Rufutsa in Zambia, it was about trust. And there in Western Uganda, it was about people having belief in themselves. Okay, I may not be a sorcerer, I don't have a Muzungu friend, but I can do what she did. It works, right?
How fascinating. What an absolute wealth of knowledge is needed to look at how things work well and how to encourage others to join in. Wow, that's amazing.
This week's episode of Tree Lady Talks is sponsored by Pear Technology. I have Jonathan Smith with me. Tell us about Pear Technology.
Pear Technology offers software for tree surveying, mapping and management for arboricultural consultants and site managers. We have two main offerings. One, directly the Pear Technology offering, which is mapping and Pocket GIS. That gives a fixed cost and an option of subscription. And in December, we purchased Otis, which has a subscription-based offering, uses an Android app on the phone, and that synchronises the data to a website. That's particularly useful for managing stock of trees on an individual site, but also covers BS 5837.
And where can people find you?
People can find us on peartechnology.co.uk.
And you're going to be an exhibitor at the Trees, Planning and Construction Conference, more of which at the end of this podcast. So moving to another part of the world, I saw you had a post on LinkedIn about mangroves and some people's belief system that mangroves should be removed to provide food. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, well, I'm surprised that somebody still buys that particular dope, right? I mean, presumably by now, most of us know that mangroves are great at protecting shores from storm surges. They are fantastic as nurseries for fishes and shrimps and God knows what other weird and wonderful creatures. And they are great at locking down carbon. But apparently some people still believe, or can still be made to believe, that getting rid of mangroves and replacing them with shrimp ponds is a great idea for global nutrition. Well, turns out we didn't actually know whether that was true or not. Nobody bothered to check it out. And it's difficult to check it out because the complexity of a mangrove system is so great. So many species use mangroves at different times of their life cycle that it's really, really hard to quantify how much nutrition is produced by a spot of land occupied by mangroves and compare that to the nutrition provided by the same spot of land that's turned into a shrimp farm. So I have colleagues in Indonesia who figured a workaround. Basically, they used publicly available data and created some of their own databases to just estimate what proportion of animal foods were eaten by human populations living close to shrimp farms or living close to mangroves. And it turns out that living close to a shrimp farm did nothing for your nutrition, which is obvious if you think about it. The shrimp end up in the supermarkets of the rich world. They don't end up in local stomachs. Whereas the people who lived close to mangrove systems had much, much better nutritional profiles, simply because the mangroves produced all of these varied food sources that people have. And on top of that, the mangroves protected them from storm surges. So mangroves are great and are another one of these technologies that are difficult to spread because people don't quite understand how they work. Yes, we all know mangroves are great, but do we know that you can actually do farming with mangroves? Do we know that we can actually restore degraded areas with mangroves? Do we know that this is profitable? We don't know it, even though the data exists. And if I'm allowed to make a plug, I'd love to make a plug here to my friend Neil Spackman. You can find him on LinkedIn, who's done some of the most extraordinary work at it, showing how you can go in the most godforsaken, destructed areas in the world and restore them to high productivity using mangroves. And interestingly enough, you don't just restore the sea bit with the mangroves, you also use the resulting ecosystemic processes to restore the land bit. So you begin to have more productive lands right next to these mangroves and not just more productive mangroves and sea breeding grounds for fishes, for example.
Talking about those different sort of ideas and getting things to work in action, I mean, I wonder about the interplay between policy and incentives throughout the world.
Policy matters enormously to craft incentives. We fail to understand how crucially important they are, but from the moment we wake up, these policy frameworks direct our lives. Your toothpaste is safe because there are policies guaranteeing that some guy cannot sell an unsafe toothpaste because it's cheaper, right? Your job is there because it is regulated in some way. If you're a baker, you can be assured that you buy good, clean, safe bread because it's being regulated. So we don't think about those, but they're crucially important. And when they're missing, when these policy frameworks are missing, that's when you get the kind of situation that you get in Somalia, where life is nasty, brutish, and short, simply because it's so hard to be sure of everything. However, even if you are in an environment in which policies are by and large well crafted, incentives can go awry. You just have to compare the way it works in different rich country systems, for example. It's much, much better to be ill almost anywhere in Europe than to be ill in the US. In the US, being sick can break you because it can literally cost you your house. You know, I read a case of a woman a few days ago who was embroiled in a car accident. It was not her fault. Her baby was taken to hospital. It died 2 days later. the hospital charged her $180,000 for 2 days of care for her baby. Now, that kind of obscenity is completely unknown in Europe. And that kind of obscenity is common in the United States because the incentives are aligned differently. We're not talking about healthcare here, so I won't go into the details, but exactly the same sort of thing applies to farming systems, right? The incentives for farmers in Europe is to grow big or get out. Because only if you have a very large farm can you afford the machinery, can you afford the financial instruments, can you afford the fertilizer, the pesticides, etc., etc. If you're a small farmer, you're going to be suffering. The incentives in Africa are similar in a way. The risks are different. Yeah, you have a risk of starvation or falling into real poverty and having to migrate to the slums of the cities, which is not a risk you have in the UK. But you also have that risk. So there's also a very strong incentive to try to make money as quickly as possible. By and large, the incentive to plan for the long term is not present in those systems. Sometimes it's provided by the private sector. Insurance policies, for example, can give you some of those incentives. But in environments in which, like most African environments in which insurance is not available, those incentives aren't there. And unless the society provides those incentives, you can very much go in the wrong direction. And that applies at every single level. For example, if you're a development NGO who is trying to gain funding from the British government to do something in the rural environment, your incentive is going to be to promise whatever the bureaucrat giving that money out wants to hear. And if the bureaucrat giving out that money believes in something suboptimal, you're going to promise them something suboptimal, at least you got the money. And that's why you end up with all of these failed agricultural projects in Africa. Because somebody tries something, it doesn't work, doesn't matter, they write a beautiful report at the end, they got paid, they go home. The incentive for agroforestry is completely different. It takes much longer. You have to nurture the trees, you regenerate them, you plant them. You will gain benefits over years and decades, not over the short lifetime of a project. But how do you put these incentives in for government? Government has an incentive to encourage the use of agrochemicals. Because if you're importing 1 million tons of fertilizer, it's relatively easy to scam off a few percent to pad your bank account. If you're teaching farmers how to do agroforestry, it's going to be a lot harder to do that, right? So these incentives are misaligned in many, many environments. And in the environments when the incentives become better aligned, typically things change in the right direction very, very, very quickly. And the best example of that is in India. India, about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, recognized that green revolution technologies had run their course. They're doing great, but water overuse, pollution, soil degradation, etc., was getting worse and worse and worse. And they had some people who really understood the important role of crop rotations and manure, including human manure, trees, etc. And they called that originally zero-based natural farming, ZBNF, and it started in Andhra Pradesh, and it's now in 3 or 4 Indian states. It's financed directly by state governments or the federal government. It doesn't depend on donors, which means there is continuity behind the funding and the idea. And by now it's involved millions of farmers. And we are the ones who are monitoring the outcomes and the impacts of that. And they are nothing short but spectacular, especially in terms of resilience. It's not that productivity has gone up so much, but it's that resilience is there. You don't have these big swings of income and of nutrition that you used to have depending on the weather. Those have disappeared. And you also have far fewer problems with pollution because the farmers are buying so fewer inputs. And if you travel in those areas, the best sign is, again, it's these anecdotal signs, right? Poor farmers will have thatch on their roofs. Middle-income farmers will have iron sheets on their roofs. But in parts of southern India, where this has become widespread, it's mostly tiles, red tiles on their roofs, just like we have at home.
Hi everybody, I'm Sarah Dodd, the owner of Tree Law, and I'm a massive fan of Tree Lady Talks.
So Patrick, is there hope that we can feed the world in a time of climate change?
Good Lord, we are feeding the world. We are producing about 5,000 calories per human being alive on the planet today, and there's 8 billion of us. And the reason why it seems we don't have enough food is because we insist on feeding a large proportion of those calories into cars. Biofuels are an absolute nightmare, and whoever signed up for those 20 years ago deserves to be placed on the hall of infamy. Did you know, for example, that over half of the palm oil imported into Europe is used for biodiesel? When you put diesel in your car, you're burning palm oil. I mean, it's crazy, right? So we insist on doing that. And we also have an immoderate love for meat, and most meat is pretty badly produced. And so a lot of the maize we produce, a lot of the soy we produce is fed into the bellies of animals. A lot of the soy produced in Brazil, where it's partly grown on land that was formerly the Amazon rainforest, goes to Denmark or to China to feed pork. So we have a lot of fat in the system, in the sense that we produce many, many more calories than we need. The reason why some people don't have enough to eat is not because we don't produce enough food, is because of the economics and because of the politics. If you're in the middle of Yemen, where a war's been raging for 20 years, it's really, really hard to do anything to gain an income to buy food. Whereas if you're in Saudi Arabia, which has exactly the same kind of desert environment, everybody's fat, right? So you have these massive differences, but they are very rarely linked to the fact that we don't produce enough food. Now, the second part of your question is, can we do that at the time of climate change? Well, we are getting better at farming all the time. We are not getting, our pesticides, for example, the pesticides we have today are not necessarily as bad as the pesticides we had 20 years ago, although neonicotinoids are definitely worse. But we learn how to use them better. We learn how to use fertilizers better. We breed new varieties of crops that are better able to resist a drought spell or a flood spell. So we have ways of adapting, and this adaptation part is going to become increasingly important. Finally, from my perspective, the agroecology perspective, there is a welcome renewed interest in traditional plants and traditional crops. Just yesterday, the American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was in Africa pushing a program to encourage Africans to grow their traditional crops again. After decades of America dumping its cereals into Africa, that's major progress. So there is progress in that as well. Finally, we need to remind ourselves that we are not condemned to turn the planet into a hot hell. Every single industry you turn towards, you have bright sparks, brain boxes, figuring out how to do more with less. Your cars are more efficient. Your glass is more efficient at retaining heat instead of letting it go out. If you've put a double glazing in last year compared to the double glazing of 20 years ago, it's a massive improvement. The foods are being grown in more efficient ways. We recycle more. We buy less packaging. The cement, cement, steel, glass, and chemicals. Those are the big producers of greenhouse gases. And in each of these industries, you find people are developing ways of doing more with less. And you see it in the data. I mean, if you look at the economic growth and the greenhouse gas emission data for Europe, it started decoupling about 25, 30 years ago. Economic growth keeps on going up, but greenhouse gas emissions are going down, not as quickly as they need to go down. And yes, we've got China and India and Brazil and Nigeria and all that investing heavily in coal. But even there, a lot of these freshly built coal plants are being mothballed because coal is too expensive and it's so cheap to put solar panels up now. You have solar panels being the main constraints on the rollout of solar panels is supply. They're just, even though there's massive production capacity in China, the demand around the world for these things is so great that sometimes you have to wait 6 months or a year to get them. And why do people want them? Because they want to save the planet? No, because it's a cheaper way of making electricity than running coal in a coal-fired thermal plant. So we have there's progress absolutely everywhere. Will it be enough for 1.5 degree? No, we're probably at 1.5 degree already. Will it be enough for 2 degrees? Well, maybe, but probably not. Does that matter? Well, yes, because it does mean that we're going to get more and more climate shocks. But are these climate shocks world-terminating events? No, they'll not be that. And the better we get at increasing the way we manage these different systems, the better we let the animal spirits of capitalism figure out how to innovate a way out of this on any conceivable industry you care to mention, the more likely we are to succeed, provided policymakers do their job and provide the right incentives. If the incentives are to burn coal, then coal's what's going to be burned.
So finally, Patrick, what is your dream scenario?
I'm 58 now, and with a bit of luck, I've got another 30 years left before I meet my maker. And that brings us to 2055, say, right? The world in 2055 will be a world in which there will be many, many more trees on farms, in which there will be much less poverty, in which there is going to be much better development and much more development across Africa. There's going to be far more Africans then than there are now, because it's the one continent that still has high population growth rates. Everybody else has their numbers are diminishing. We are going to get most of our energy from nuclear power and renewables. We are going to get most of our transport from electrified machines for personal transport and from ammonia-powered machines when it comes to ships and planes and trucks. We are going to be much, much better at managing ourselves as societies. There's going to be far fewer cars in our cities. There's going to be far better public transport. We're going to be walking more. Life is generally going to be more pleasant, and we're going to be better insulated, because climate change we're not going to cut emissions tomorrow, which means climate change then will be worse than climate change today. We just had a couple of weeks of snow. It was gorgeous. I hadn't seen that for 11 years, and I'll probably not see that again in my lifetime, right? But that also doesn't matter that much, because the housing will be better insulated. It won't be heated with gas anymore. It'll be heated with electricity from those nuclear power plants and those renewables. So we are going to be living on a planet which has the tools to make the world a better place. Where they're the idiots currently running Russia or China or Iran actually rejoin the rest of the planet to move in that direction, as opposed to playing their little toddler games in their sandpits, is something that remains to be seen. But I'm optimistic. What does that leave us with as a big problem to worry about? Maybe it is artificial intelligence after all. Although judging by the difficulty, I had to get ChatGPT 4 to do what I wanted this morning. I think we've got a few years left before it becomes really dangerous.
I love your optimism. That was a brilliant dream scenario. Patrick Worms, thank you so much for your time and your great thoughts. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
And just before we go, time to tell you about our very exciting new conference in February 2024.
Trees, planning and construction. Is it really working? Do you feel isolated? Well, this conference plans to change that. We're here at BS 5837 Speed Briefing. Biodiversity net gain, what does it mean for trees? And trees and planning law, are you up to date? Sarah Dodd will tell us. Hear from keynote speaker Keith Saker and Jeremy Barrell. We'll hear the views of London Tree Officer John Ryan on what works well and ideas for the future, and a panel of experts, a planning consultant, highway engineer, demolition contractor and building contractor, and I will be saying what works for me. All this and outdoor demonstrations on the 20th of February 2024 here at Braxted Park. And thanks to our headline sponsors, Bartram Trees, we're offering cut price tickets for tree officers. See us at Sharon Hosegood Associates /training or Eventbrite Trees, Planning and Construction.